Okay, since the last video is still kind of fresh in my mind, I'd like to expand on it and add to it and address some of the problems uh, with some of my hypotheses or statements. I mentioned that there is a possibility that you know two or more nappers can be working independently and come up with the same exact point, right? This one here, I pointed to this one here as an example. Um, Now, the word exact can get me into trouble there, and someone could say, "Well, it's not exact, and you're using a bold statement, and that's not right." Like you said, who's being the narcissist now, and that kind of thing. So let me clarify that. Um, in engineering work and other technical fields, we have tolerances, right? So I'm always working with tolerances in my head. So I know that's a kind of a cop out, but there are tolerances, there are variations, there are ranges in which points can be classified as exactly the same kind of point, but there's variations in the flaking and variables, okay? Tolerances and acceptable ranges of variation. So I'd like to improve upon that statement and say within tolerances, more than one napper can create the same point. It won't be exact, so that was not a good word to use. Okay, now it brings up another issue, the range of variation. Okay, now I was talking mainly in the last video about making the same kind of flakes, the negative and positive scars, the waste flakes, the same kind of waste flakes and the same kind of flake scars with different tools. Okay, there's at least two different ways to make the same flake and the flake scar. Okay, but there's a flip side to that. There is a we know as flip nappers that we can use the same tool to make different kinds of flakes and flake scars. So it's conceivable that an entire point can be made with nothing but one tool. Now, it's easy to make a point with only indirect percussion as a technique. You may modify or use different tips and different bits, different tools. Start with a larger one and work down, but it's still all indirect percussion, right? You can make a whole tool with just one napping tool. You can make a whole point with just one napping tool, and you'll have a wide range of flakes with spurs and special platform characteristics on these flakes that are going to be different from each other. They're not all going to be the same. If you use a pressure flaker to create flakes on a point, and you look at the waste flakes, the ones you removed, and compare all the platforms and all the characteristics and the length and the width and the thickness and all that, they're going to be different. There's a range of flakes from that one tool. Okay. Now, I was talking also about using copper and other metals, aluminum and steel. Now, if we can reduce down the discussion to only natural materials and limit ourselves further by only those natural materials that are found in context with the points. Okay, that narrows it down quite a bit. However, we don't know for sure if that's the entire tool set. Now, there are very well preserved tool sets in context with finished and unfinished points. And I may get into some of those as a separate video because those are interesting, right? And so it seems like we have an entire tool set and the entire assemblage of resulting arrowheads and knives and bifaces from that tool set. But those are extremely rare, and they get more and more rare as the points and artifacts get older. Okay, so the older they are, the less we have as far as perishable materials the antler and the bone and the leather pads and all that kind of stuff are gone now. We don't have them, and we don't know the extent of their toolkits. Okay. So, but just narrowing it down to natural materials gives us a pretty good field to work within, an arena to work within. So because we don't have these huge, gigantic, baffling choices. Okay, we're limited. Now, let's just say that a hammerstone, a hard hammerstone, has 5 different flake types that you can make with a hammerstone. Short, tiny flakes. We're not talking about shatter and minute flakes. We're talking about short, maybe edge dressing flakes, blending flakes, or flakes in between to even out a surface. And those are going to be relatively small. And then we have the medium-sized flakes and the large flakes, so that's 3. And then we have bold flakes like overshots that can be done with a hammerstone. And then other flakes like, well, let's say bold flakes from the base shooting into the point. So from the side and from the base, bold flakes. So that's 5 from a hammerstone. And similar flakes can be done with a billet, let's say. Okay, so there's 5 and 5. Now, a lot of advocates are implying, a lot of advocates for the flake analysis and resulting special flakes are of the, they imply that they see these flakes as distinctive to each tool. Okay, and there's no overlap. That means none of these can be confused with any of these. None of the hammerstone flakes can be confused with any of the billet flakes. That's what they're implying. But as flint knappers, we know that there is some overlap. Now that overlap is where the mystery and the uncertainty come in. Okay, and that's why I say there's at least more than one way to create the same flake, because I know that there's overlap. And this may be a better way to discuss that topic. Okay, there's overlap between these, and there's also an overlap between pressure flaking. Let's say there's 5 different types of flakes you can get from pressure and 5 different billet flakes, and we compare those. Are they completely distinct from each other, or is there some overlap so you can't tell the difference between the two? I believe, and through experience, there is overlap. Okay, especially when you have an antler billet made of whitetail and a pressure flaker made of whitetail, and the billet is kind of small and the pressure flaker is kind of big. Okay, it's very difficult to tell the difference between the flakes, but the techniques are very different. One is pressure, one is percussion, completely separate. Okay, so that even with the constriction of such few tools to work with within the abo context or the natural materials, there's still overlap between the flake types. And there's still similarities between the flake types to such an extent that we cannot tell the difference in some cases. Okay, there's that. Now, another criticism may be, well, what about probabilities? We can develop probabilities. It's for these flakes. Like some flakes are more probably made from hammerstones, and there's probabilities for flakes to be made from pressure flakers and probabilities from other techniques. We can develop probabilities. Okay. Yes, that's true. But, and there's always a big but. We're depending on archaeologists that are actively engaged in flint knapping. I forget the term off the top of my head. But they're trying to recreate the conditions, okay? And then from experimental archaeology, they try to create the initial conditions for making these tools. They go through the whole process. They become proficient knappers. They understand the process and everything, and they become very good, and they replicate points. And that's the experimental archaeology benefit, is they can develop understandings of how these things are made. And then we can, from their experiences, develop probabilities. Like most of my flakes that I get from pressure are of this type. So when I look at real artifacts and if I notice something that's like that, the probability is they were using pressure. Yes, that is true. But, you know, the sample size of the archaeologists that are doing the experimental archaeology is relatively small. Okay, it wouldn't be so bad if there were thousands and thousands, like I'd say maybe 10,000 experimental archaeologists all contributing to one database, okay, worldwide, right, just to include everybody's ideas. And then maybe we can get closer to these accurate probabilities, and maybe that'll be the case someday, okay? But for now, everyone is kind of at different skill levels. They're in different camps as far as biases and certain schools of thought. Just like martial arts, there's different schools of martial arts, where there's different schools of archaeology, different schools of experimental archaeology. Some may follow a certain napping group, certain napping styles. Some may follow others. So, some European groups are off on their own and do mainly blade technology. They don't really get into biface technology very much in some groups. Some groups are very heavily into bifaces. I mean, it's just all scattered right now. So what we have is a small sample of a small number of experimental archaeologists trying to give us probabilities for vast numbers of points that are existing in the archaeological record. And again, that's working through induction, where you take a small sample and you try to extrapolate it to a large, to apply it to something large. And it doesn't work. It's not the way science advances. Now, it's a cool thing to look at, and it's a neat thing to discuss and to improve, but that's as far as that goes. That's as far as you can take it. You have to take that one with a grain of salt, those kinds of pursuits. To me, to get around this and the debate and all that kind of stuff, is just to pretty much put it in the background. The foreground should be the data. It shouldn't be so hard to find the data on these sites. How many points were there, or how many were perfect and how many were field types or imperfect or weird eccentric types? Stick it all together. Give us an aggregate of all the man-made flakes. That's important. Tell us how finely you screen them. If you're screening at greater than, or a 1/4 inch screens or greater, you're missing a lot of small, minute flakes that could be important. Okay, you don't know if they were doing a lot of abrading or not, unless you see a lot of chatter, or a lot of powdery flakes. Now, if you go down to an 1/8 inch screen, it slows down the whole process. I know, I understand all that. If you go finer, it's even worse. But it's important that we have an aggregate. I think those are the most important pieces of data, when you have the whole gigantic assemblage, and from the smallest flakes to the biggest flakes, instead of just from the medium size to the biggest, or maybe some of the medium and some of the biggest, because they can't excavate the whole area. But whatever you can get, be accurate with it. There's some sites that have excellent data and they publish everything, and it's not that difficult to get. But most studies have the data either recorded incorrectly, recorded sporadically, not recorded in a way that we can use it as flint nappers and as experimental archaeologists, or just plain hidden behind paywalls and inaccessible unless you're at a certain university or you know someone you can get into a museum or a library or something that's limited access that has the artifacts in it. I know a lot of museums in places are open to the public, which is great. Okay, but making it accessible online is a lot better, I think, because you have lots of minds looking at it, and they can all participate in the discussion. Okay, so the data is first, and I know from experience that data is not something that is just a small part of what you can do. There's a lot to do with the data. It takes a lot of time and effort. If you're worried about having a job and being able to do something, there's plenty to do in recording the data properly, learning from sites, and how to improve the next data collection, how to make a cost list of all the things you need to do to get each piece of data you want, right? And then set up a site that's accessible, or set up papers that are accessible for the public, right? But the way it's going now, a lot of it, I know this is wishful thinking now, but a lot of what's going on now is there's a discussion on the data from the experts and stuff, and I don't say they're not experts, they are experts, but then you have discussions of the discussions, and then you have discussions of those discussions, and you get further and further from the data, and sometimes I go and look at the data, and I remember the discussion, and they do not match. Where are they getting this from? They're extrapolating from very little data a bunch of implications and a bunch of things that they say that they can get from induction from these small bits of data. They can get a lot of things to discuss, and I don't know, it's just kind of weird. So putting it mildly, it's kind of weird, but the data is very, very important. So instead of just criticizing, what I'm going to do is I don't save any of my waste flakes and stuff like that from my nappings, but I'm going to start. That's one of the reasons why I restarted the Abo channel, Allergic Hobbit. I'm going to start saving the flakes. I'm going to start experimenting, shooting and destroying the points, looking at impact fractures and all that, making things with stone tools, doing more research on things like how available was copper and how available was antler and things like that. Were they trading in hammerstones? Were they trading in antler? Were they trading points? Did they have prototypes that they were looking at? Like, if the tribe have a sacred point in one of the lodges that everyone had to make the point according to the sacred point. You know, if you wanted to learn how to make a knife, you'd go to the lodge and there was one hanging up in perfect condition, and the chief would say, yeah, this is how we make our knives in such and such tribe, and it's the sacred point. And everyone was like, ooh, you know, they learned and they copied exactly. I mean, is that the case? Of course, we don't know for sure, and that's kind of a funny scenario, but you get the idea, right? I'm going to, again, I'm going to be working with and destroying and doing those kind of things with the points I'll be making, instead of sticking them in boxes and bins like this, or as wall hangers, or giving them away. I'm going to start destroying them, okay, and see what happens. See if my assessments are correct on some of these. Now, that leads me to another thing where sometimes people ask the question, did the nappers have in mind a preconceived notion of what they wanted to nap, and how important was the mental picture, or what they call the mental template? How important was that, and did it exist? And do I use it? And things like that. And yes, it existed, I use it, and it's very important. Okay? Now, did these mental templates and these sacred points, perfect, did they get passed down from generation to generation? Yes, but sometimes they probably didn't, and nappers had to rediscover napping at several different time periods, right? And that's my opinion. I think that the skills of flint napping were gained and lost, and it was ebb and tide. The tide that would ebb and flow as far as knowledge of napping throughout history, and some cultures would forget it entirely for a little while and pick it back up later. Some had a very strong cultural lineage of flint knapping that lasted for thousands of years, and that kind of thing. It was variable. Now, how important is a mental template? Okay. If you want to pursue the idea that it's possible to judge or determine a culture by its points, that's extremely important, because a mental template is going to be in that culture, right? That's extremely important in that respect. Now, when you have a mental template based on an actual point, you are going to use your tools in such a way to create flakes that look like the flakes on that point. If it's not just in your head, but if you have an actual point, no matter what tool you're using, you're going to try to make flakes that look like the flakes on that point. Okay, you know what I mean? You may discard certain types of materials that don't produce the flakes you want, but some guys will say, well, I can make those flakes with a hammerstone. I don't know why you're getting rid of your hammerstones. And the other guy says, well, it's because I can't make that same kind of flake, so I'm using something else. Okay, whatever. So people are going to have different tool sets to make the same looking type point. Okay, if you have a strong mental template, strong culture on these points. So you won't be able to tell really which tool made it. Now, if you have a weak mental template and a weak cultural influence, yeah, the tool may the tool may leave the same marks because you're not trying to adjust anything. You're just going with the flow. The hammerstone makes cruddy flakes, but I don't care because we're all using hammerstones, and it's all variable. We don't really care too much about how it looks. We just want points that look fairly consistent. So yeah, all of our flakes look like hammerstone flakes, and we don't care. We don't care to refine it or whatever. But some cultures are going to refine their techniques, build composite tools, go hundreds of miles to get the right tool stone and tool material to create their mental template. Okay, so that's something to think about there too. And I forgot to mention that. And it's a good question on the mental templates. Now, do I use a mental template? Yes, of course. And I use physical examples too. Now, one more thing about mental templates is, even though you have a strong mental template, you can have variations in the point types, and this complicates everything. Okay, so that just puts one more wrench in the works, and one more reason why I don't think anyone can tell how these things were made. And people that discuss things like flake signatures and flake patterns and judge a point to be a certain type because of the flake pattern, all that stuff is mumbo jumbo as far as I'm concerned. Okay, I know that's very annoying for some people, but anyway, even if you have a strong mental template, you can come up with stuff like this. Let's say this culture has a very strong mental template, but yet their knappers are making things like this. Okay, narrow, wide, and in the middle. Where is the mental template here? Well, in this case, I chose these based on stem morphology, or the characteristics of the stem. These stems are almost identical in proportion, knapping style, thickness, what they call the metrics of this stem. I didn't really pay attention to the blade for two reasons. One, I don't think the blade's that important, and number two, the blades are missing on these two. But anyway, a culture can have a strong mental template and yet still come up with variations like this. Now, were these made by the same person? Probably not. Now, can you look and see and tell me that this base was made with the same exact tools as this, or this stem was made with exactly the same tools and techniques as that stem and same as that stem? No. For one, it's probably not the same napper. Even with a strong mental template, in this case with the base morphology, you still have variation. Not only in the blade, but in the techniques, because it's not the same napper. Now, this might be a coincidence, but it could be the same napper doing all three. Okay, but there are dozens like this, not just three. There are hundreds and thousands of stems that look just like this. Are all of those made in the same way with the same tools? Now, some might say, well, it doesn't matter if they're all made with the same way or the same tools. I can pick one up at random and tell you exactly how that was made. Just at random because of the flake characteristics and the signatures. Again, you're deceiving yourself. Okay? Unless you have, I don't know, unless you have some way of creating a huge database with all the initial conditions and then all the results and all the resulting flakes, and then are able to enter the data from this into that database and make a comparison. I don't see how you can do it just with your brain, to look at it and say, I know how that's done, just by looking at it through experience. You would need an incredible database to do it. And even with that database, in flint knapping, we have a very strange condition, right? We have a condition where the initial conditions determine what it's going to look like, right? As far as a flake goes, all the initial conditions, the force applied, the angle of force, the material, and all that. The initial conditions are going to determine what the flake looks like. However, extremely subtle variation in initial conditions can result in a drastic difference in the final result. That approaches the phenomenon of chaos. That's what chaos looks like. Extremely slight variations in initial conditions can produce wildly different results, and that is as close as we can get to randomness as far as in the pursuit of something. Okay, so in flint knapping, that is very much a part of what we do. We tweak and we use very subtle differences in the initial conditions to produce results that are wildly different. Okay, and you're not taking that into account when you're saying to yourself, I know how that was made. Now you can get close to it by saying, well, I'm not looking at the intent, I'm just looking at the result. And this flake, with scientific analysis, can be determined to have been removed at a certain speed, with a certain amount of force, with a certain size platform. So therefore, I can tune my analysis and get it down to where it's a small tipped flaker with a certain amount of force, and that can only be done with a certain material. We can rule out using a small stone, or rule out using a small sliver of horn. It has to be a small sliver of something very hard like ivory or heat-treated antler or something like that. Okay, you can get very close, but is it going to be perfect? No. Hopefully we can get really close. That'd be pretty awesome. But the way it stands now, I don't see anyone getting anywhere near that close. Okay, so that's where I stand on that. And I think I ranted long enough and made some comments that might tick some people off. We'll see how it goes. Okay.